In the valley of the Hua mountain range, mist descended not in haste, but with the kind of patience that was neither indifferent nor deliberate. The pines stood in still formation on the lower slopes, each bearing the memory of wind-stirred nights and sun-softened dawns. Crickets murmured within roots hidden from sight. The ground itself carried a quiet intelligence. Its stillness was not emptiness but invitation. From the western ridge, travelers could sometimes see a single figure pausing by a slow-moving stream, hands behind his back, gaze set not on the path ahead, but on the way water curved around stone. He wore robes that bore the weight of neither silk nor ceremony. The fabric hung loose, washed more by river and rain than by any formal hand. His beard, thin and pointed, danced only when the wind thought it necessary. Behind him, a donkey stood tethered without urgency, its head dipped low to the grass. The man's name was not known to most. Even among those who had crossed his path, few would remember a title or lineage. But in the minds of those who had lingered long enough to hear him speak of balance and effortlessness, the name Laozi would echo with the persistence of a river-shaping stone. Years before the Tao Te Ching would be written, if such a thing could be said to have ever been written at all, he walked these paths without purpose. Not without intention but without purpose. For to Laozi, purpose was a tether to desire, and desire in all its forms was a narrowing of vision. What could be learned by aiming toward an end, when so much could be seen in the moment's unfolding? The village below the mountain bore no official name, nor did it need one. Those who lived there knew the rhythm of its seasons better than any title might suggest. Its soil grew turnips and yams, though not always in abundance. The people there, accustomed to silence as both comfort and necessity, watched as the old man, though not yet truly old, walked past without needing to explain where he was going. There was no need to greet him loudly. A nod sufficed. A glance of acknowledgement between two who understood that wisdom does not often announce itself. Children followed him once, but only once. They expected tales of dragons or battles or ghostly riddles. Instead, he knelt by a reed and watched it bend under the soft persuasion of the morning breeze. When he stood again, he spoke not to the children but to the reed, thanking it for its lesson. The children, unsure of whether they had witnessed something profound or pointless, returned to their games. Their elders, upon hearing of this, said nothing. They had seen this before. He often paused by the northern riverbank, where the wind gathered in swirling circles and the willows moved as though brushing against old dreams. It was here, beneath the lean branches and against the stone ledge shaped by water and time, that Laozi began his practice of listening to the wind, not for messages but for pattern, not for prophecy but for stillness. The wind, in its varying forms, became his silent teacher. On some days it came in bursts, stirring dust and leaves into temporary dances. On others, it whispered through grass as if reciting something ancient and unfinished. What fascinated Laozi was not the sound but what existed beneath it, the space that made the sound possible. Just as a bowl is shaped by clay but useful because of its emptiness, so too was the wind revealed through absence. The mountains nearby carried stories, but Laozi seldom retold them. He had once lived among officials, among scholars who inscribed judgments onto bamboo slats and debated systems that attempted to order the unpredictable. His feet had touched palace floors and garden stones arranged to mirror constellations. Yet none of those geometries had offered the peace he found in the wind's movement through branches, or in the way a frog paused between croaks on warm afternoons. In the evenings, villagers lit slow-burning lamps of animal fat and resin. Smoke curled upward and faded. Laozi remained outside, seated on flat stone warmed by the fading light. He did not meditate in the way monks later would. There was no formal sitting posture, no litany of breath counting or visualizations. Stillness to him was not something achieved but something returned to, like a pond ceasing to ripple not because it was forced, but because nothing disturbed it. One evening, a farmer named Min approached with offerings: 3 boiled eggs wrapped in cloth and a cup of barley tea. He did not speak until he sat down. Laozi gestured toward the eggs but took nothing. The farmer, unused to quiet that lingered beyond politeness, eventually broke it with a question. "Do you not grow hungry?" The wind stirred then, passing between them as if interrupting or answering. Laozi responded slowly, not in refusal but with a kind of curiosity. "Hunger comes, but it is not always mine." This was not a riddle, though it sounded like one. Min nodded without understanding, sensing it was not meant to be solved. The moon that night appeared early, its shape soft and slightly distorted by haze. Min remained seated long after Laozi had left, trying to recall the precise way he had spoken. But the words slipped through memory like water held too tightly. Later that month, a teacher from the next province arrived in the village. He had heard of a man who watched grass and listened to trees. He sought insight, perhaps a phrase he could take back to his students. The teacher found Laozi by a shallow stream, watching as ants carried fragments of leaf up a bent stalk. He introduced himself, offered formal bows, and asked what he believed to be a wise question. "What, in your view, is the nature of stillness?" Laozi looked toward the ants, then toward the teacher, and after some time replied, "Stillness is not what resists movement. It is what does not become it." The teacher blinked. "So, it is absence?" "No," Laozi answered. "It is presence without shape." The conversation did not continue. The teacher, unsure whether he had received an answer or been dismissed, bowed again and left. Stillness, as Laozi came to understand it, was not an action or even a condition. It was a tendency of the universe to return to balance when left alone. Like dust settling in a room once footsteps have passed, or water clearing once the hand is withdrawn. The wind did not teach him to resist. It taught him to yield without losing form. It showed him that motion and quiet are not enemies, but companions, each defining the other. Over time, villagers noticed that their own steps grew slower when approaching the stream. They spoke less. They lingered longer beneath willow branches and took notice of the way shadows moved when clouds passed. They did not consider themselves followers of a sage, nor disciples of a philosophy. They were farmers, weavers, potters. Yet in their hands and footsteps, something of Laozi's stillness had settled, like dust on a windowsill unshaken by the wind. That season rains came late but steady. The crops survived. No celebrations were held, but there was quiet gratitude. At dusk, some villagers stood alone by the river, not to draw water, but to listen. Whether they understood the wind or simply needed its company, none could say. Laozi remained near the stream, occasionally speaking, more often silent. He did not write, though later a scribe would claim to have recorded his words. What mattered, perhaps, was not the teaching itself, but the quiet it left behind. The wind returned with a different cadence as spring gave way to summer. Its rhythm was no longer cool and curling but warmer, more deliberate. The pines held their branches steady beneath its weight, and the grasses bent lower, holding the sunlight on their tips like dew. In the village below, the days grew longer but quieter. Even the children's laughter, once sharp and sudden, took on a softer edge. Laozi did not retreat into solitude, nor did he increase his presence. He simply remained, a constant shape moving among impermanent things. The villagers began to adjust their rhythm without conscious thought. They rose not with the cock's crow alone, but with the slow unveiling of morning light across the rice fields. Where once they hurried to the edge of the stream to fill their pails, now they paused, waiting for the water to settle before drawing it. No one said why. It felt natural, as if the wind itself had reminded them how to move. One morning, an old woman named Li, a widow known more for her practical wit than spiritual interest, began leaving bowls of warm broth on the rock where Laozi often sat. She never watched him eat nor asked if he had. But the bowls returned empty, and the next day she returned with more. One evening her daughter asked why. "He watches the wind," Li replied, "and because of that the cows don't startle so easily anymore." It was not meant as a joke, though it might have sounded like one. There was a strange order growing in the disorder of things. Further into the forest, where the stream twisted into narrower paths and the shadows grew longer, Laozi spent afternoons seated among the reeds. From a distance he might have appeared asleep, but his posture never slumped, and his breathing carried the slow cadence of attention. On one occasion a young man named Jun approached, a scribe by training, traveling between courts to record decrees and taxes. He had heard of the quiet man who observed trees and ants in silence. Jun arrived with scrolls bound in red string, a brush of wolf's hair and a bottle of dark ink. He carried knowledge of legal codes, ancestral rites, and the metaphors favored by scholars. He bowed and waited. Laozi, seated upon a large flat stone, motioned to the place beside him. Jun obeyed. For a while neither spoke. Birds flitted between trees. The wind carried pollen and memory through the underbrush. Finally, Jun unfurled a scroll and asked, "If one were to write down the wind, what would it say?" Laozi's eyes remained on the stream. "The wind says nothing, but the leaves remember." Jun paused, then tried again. "If stillness were taught, how should it be taught?" "There is nothing to teach," Laozi said. "Stillness does not need instruction. It needs removal." "Of what?" Jun asked. Laozi pointed toward the stream. A leaf floated by, caught briefly on a stone, then dislodged, continuing on. "That," he said, "is stillness. It does not stop the leaf. It gives it nothing to cling to." Jun, unsettled but intrigued, returned over the following weeks. Each time he brought fresh scrolls, recording nothing at first. He listened. He watched. He learned to recognize the different movements of the wind. The whisper that moved east to west, the gust that came before midday heat, the soft pull that brought scent from the distant pines. Eventually, Jun began to write. Not Laozi's words exactly, but reflections drawn from observation. He wrote about the way silence expanded thought, and how listening without trying to understand produced a deeper kind of knowing. He wrote of the stream and the bowl, the donkey and the dust. He titled the pages not with formal headings, but with single brushstrokes. meaning west, meaning wind, meaning quiet. These writings years later would become the bones of a manuscript that others would come to call Tao Te Ching, though Laozi never claimed it. June too remained unnamed in the copies that followed. What mattered was not authorship, but what remained in the reader's stillness after the reading had ended. In time others came, not many and never in groups. A potter once stayed for 3 days saying nothing. He returned home and altered the shapes of his bowls, widening their bases and thinning their lips so they might better hold the silence between sips. A young mother, having lost her second child, sat near the stream for 2 evenings and returned with a strange calmness that unnerved her neighbors. She no longer feared silence. None of this was planned. Laozi gave no sermons. He offered no blessings. He simply remained, present, listening, becoming less a figure and more a part of the landscape itself. One late afternoon, as heat softened into haze, a local hunter found himself drawn to the clearing by the stream. He was known as a man of few words and sharp instincts. That day he carried no bow. He stood watching Laozi for a long time before finally asking, "What is gained by watching water?" Laozi, unmoving, replied, "Nothing." The hunter chuckled. "Then why do it?" "Because nothing leaves room for everything." That evening, the hunter walked deeper into the woods without his usual urgency. He took no deer. But he later told his wife the forest sounded different, less hostile, more whole. Stillness, as it unfolded in the village and in the woods, was not absence. It was a filling of space with attention so complete that no part of the moment remained unconsidered. It was not withdrawal but absorption. Not a denial of thought, but a widening of it until even the smallest details, dust in sunlight, a broken twig, the way a shadow curved at sunset, held meaning. And so the villagers changed, not by decision but by subtle shifts in posture, in breath, in silence. A weaver paused more often to watch the threads slack between knots. A cook stirred more slowly, noting the rhythm of her ladle through the soup. The bell used to call children in from the fields was rung less frequently. Sometimes it wasn't needed. None called Laozi a master. Few called him anything. Yet in time travelers passed through and remarked on the quiet of the village. Not its absence of sound, but its absence of hurry. One elder, upon hearing this, laughed gently. "It's the wind," he said, "and the man who listens to it." By midsummer, the valley had taken on a peculiar sense of presence. Even the animals moved with less caution. Birds returned earlier. Foxes were seen nearer to paths. The stream, fed by slow rains, rose gently without flooding. It became common to see villagers seated by its banks, not working, not speaking, just sitting. June continued to write, but no longer asked questions. He filled his scrolls with gentle observations: wind soft before dawn, woman crying beside still water, child watching a beetle with great care. These notes, when read by others, were sometimes mistaken for poems. But June claimed they were not. They were records of stillness, nothing more. Laozi, meanwhile, aged without effort. His beard whitened, his gait slowed, but he seemed untouched by time's weight. Those who saw him in the first days of his arrival could not say when the change had come, only that he remained as constant as the wind itself. Always present, always passing, never fully held. The valley too held him lightly. And still the wind moved. By the time the summer sun began its gentle retreat into longer shadows and cooler mornings, something had subtly shifted. The village, once marked by small routines and quiet gestures, now bore the unmistakable trace of rhythm, not imposed but emergent. The wind continued to pass through the valley, never quite the same twice. The trees moved not with resistance but familiarity. Even the water, which once hurried to escape the mountain, now meandered with a kind of reverence, as if pausing to observe its own reflection before continuing. Laozi remained unchanged in appearance, though those who observed closely could detect a thinning of energy around him. He was not weaker but lighter, like smoke that holds its form just before it disappears. His donkey, gray-furred and narrow in the hip, no longer followed him with the same attentiveness. It too had learned to wait instead of wander. June, the scribe, continued to sit with Laozi by the stream. The scrolls were now many, stacked in bundles and tied with cords made from braided reeds. The ink had begun to dry in his bottle, but he no longer refilled it often. Most of what needed writing had already found its shape. The rest, he believed, would linger in air and soil and gesture, waiting to be discovered by those attentive enough to see it. One morning, a merchant passed through the village carrying silk and salt, accompanied by 3 servants and a curious apprentice. He had heard rumors of a sage who spoke in winds and silences. Intrigued more by novelty than reverence, he approached Laozi near the bend of the river, where willows draped their arms into the water and the rocks were warm with midday light. "You are the philosopher who teaches stillness," the merchant said, his voice bearing the tone of someone accustomed to being listened to. Laozi nodded without speaking. "Then tell me, old one," he continued, "what use is stillness in a world that moves?" Laozi turned his gaze toward the ripples in the river, then toward a dragonfly balanced on a reed. "Does the dragonfly stop the world by hovering?" he asked. "Or does it remain still because it trusts the world to move around it?" The merchant furrowed his brow, uncertain whether he had been answered. His apprentice, however, knelt and watched the dragonfly in silence, while the merchant turned and continued on his way. That day, Laozi lingered longer than usual. He placed his hand in the stream not to drink but to feel its temperature. The surface was cool, but beneath it held a faint warmth. The same could be said perhaps for memory. That evening, June returned alone to the stone where they often sat. Laozi was already there, his face lit by the golden blur of late sun. The scrolls lay beside him, wrapped carefully in bark cloth. "You will leave soon," June said, not as a question but as acknowledgement. "Yes," Laozi replied. "The valley no longer needs a mirror." "Where will you go?" "Where the wind forgets its name." June bowed, and the silence between them deepened, not from absence but from fullness. When he finally rose, Laozi handed him a folded cloth. Inside it, pressed flat and dried, was a single willow leaf. "Not all things need writing," Laozi said. "Some must be carried." Words spread slowly, as it often does in places where time is not counted in minutes but in harvests and rainfall. By the following week, Laozi was no longer seen near the stream. His donkey remained tethered by the elder pine as if waiting for a signal. When the rains came, it wandered into the woods, then disappeared entirely. No one searched for it. The scrolls June had written began to circulate, carried from one province to another by monks, traders, and those curious about quiet things. But no one could agree on the name of the author. Some called him the Old Master. Others referred to him simply as the Listener. A few claimed he had been a dream, conjured by the valley during a season of unusual stillness. The stories differed. Some said he had vanished into the mountains. Others believed he had walked west until the sky swallowed him. A few claimed to have seen him again years later in a distant province, talking to a child about the way shadows change when lanterns flicker. But in the village his memory was not kept in stories. It lived in behavior. The bell no longer rang at dusk. People came home when the wind turned cool. Meals were eaten slowly. The weaver no longer worked at night, but instead watched the moonlight fall across her loom. Children were taught to listen before asking and to observe before naming. At the riverbank, small piles of stones began to appear, balanced in quiet arrangements that meant nothing and everything. Stillness had not been taught. It had arrived. And once it arrived, it stayed, not as a practice or doctrine but as part of the breath and motion of things. It needed no defense, no explanation. It lived in the hands of the potter, in the footsteps of the hunter, in the glances exchanged without speech. The world had not stopped moving, but those within it had learned when not to resist. June continued to write. Not books but fragments, observations, quiet phrases left on doorsteps or etched into stones along the stream. He never claimed authorship. He only listened as he had been taught. One autumn, years after Laozi had vanished, June took one final walk to the edge of the valley. He carried no scrolls, no tools, no ink. Only the willow leaf, pressed and whole, now browned with age. He stood beneath a cliff where the wind passed not with noise, but with pressure, a quiet resistance that softened the skin. He let the leaf go. It lifted briefly, twisted, and was gone. He did not watch its descent. He turned back toward the village, his pace steady, his breath even. Years had passed since the figure once known as Laozi vanished from the village by the stream. The valley remained, its contours untouched by time's haste, but the human presence within it had begun to change. New faces appeared, grandchildren of those who had once sat beside the stream in silence, now stepping through the same fields and drinking from the same waters, unaware of the footprints they traced. They spoke of the old one less frequently now. His name, if spoken at all, surfaced in brief remarks or metaphors. A child hesitant to disturb a resting bird might be told, "Let it be." The old one would have watched instead. A broken pot, once repaired with quiet patience, might prompt the phrase, "Stillness remembers shape." These expressions did not sound like teachings, nor were they treated as sacred. They were woven into ordinary speech, like threads that no longer drew attention but held the fabric together. The scrolls June had once copied had found their way into distant provinces. A monk in Luoyang had recopied them onto bamboo slips. Another in Chengdu had translated them into rhythmic chants. Over time the words shifted. Some phrases became poems. Others grew more rigid, shaped to suit the frameworks of court philosophy or spiritual devotion. But within the original village, nothing was formalized. What had been shared in silence was preserved in silence. June had grown old. His hands no longer held brushes with ease. His walks to the stream had grown shorter, but his eyes, still narrow and quiet, retained the ability to notice. On one of his final visits to the stone where Laozi had once sat, he found a group of children stacking flat stones into towers. Their work was careful but untrained. The towers leaned. Some fell. June did not correct them. He sat nearby and listened to their laughter. It was not the same laughter he remembered from his youth, louder perhaps and less patient, but it bore the shape of curiosity, and that was enough. One child, perhaps no older than 8, approached June and asked why the rocks sometimes fell and sometimes held. "Because they forget," June answered, "and then they remember." "Remember what?" the child asked. "That they are not alone." The answer was not explained. Did not need to be. Seasons shifted again. Snow fell late that year, dusting the rooftops and outlining the riverbank in lines of soft white. June passed in his sleep, his breath slowing like a wind retreating into the hills. His neighbors buried him in the clearing where the first balanced stones had appeared. They placed no marker, only a single round pebble upon his chest. It was enough. By now the story of Laozi had fractured into fragments. In the cities he was known as the philosopher of water, the sage of yielding, the father of the Tao. In mountain monasteries, chants carried his name before dawn, his teachings reduced to syllables. Travelers spoke of him with reverence or suspicion, depending on the needs of the moment. But in the valley there was only the wind. The stream narrowed over the years, its path shifting with the gentle erosion of time. Trees fell and grew again. The village remained small, though more connected. Traders passed through more often. Stories of war reached the valley's edge but seldom entered it. A traveler once arrived, carrying a bound copy of what he called the words of the ancient way. He asked to speak with the village elder about the origin of the text. An old woman received him, Li's granddaughter, now the keeper of the seasonal records and planting cycles. She served him tea and listened. After the traveler finished reading several passages aloud, he asked if the words were familiar. The elder nodded. "Some of them." "Do you know the author?" he pressed. She stirred the tea with a twig. "The wind wrote them." The traveler laughed politely, unsure whether he had been misunderstood or outwitted. That evening he wandered to the river. The air was still. Children were stacking stones again, their towers slightly straighter this time. A woman sat weaving near the bank, humming a pattern older than the words she sang. Somewhere behind her, an older man was sketching circles in the dirt with a stick, not drawing, not designing, simply marking time with motion. The traveler returned to his camp and recorded his impressions carefully. The village is ordinary, though something lingers. Not belief, but behavior. Elsewhere in the world, Laozi's name became a source of debate. Some scholars argued he never existed, that the Tao Te Ching was a composite of many minds. Others claimed he had traveled west to teach sages beyond the desert. A few proposed he had become immortal, his body dissolving into pure breath. But none of these stories reached the valley with force. They were carried by wind, yes, but in such a way that the village did not need to hold them. What remained were practices, rituals without names. People turned their faces toward the wind before beginning tasks, not as prayer but as habit. Meals were eaten slowly. Rivers were never spoken over. Children were taught to sit with animals quietly before approaching them. No one said these were teachings of Laozi. No one needed to. Every few years, a new scribe or seeker would arrive, hoping to reconstruct the original mind behind the text. They carried scrolls or spoke lines memorized from annotated editions. The villagers listened politely. Some even offered them food, but none tried to correct them. One such traveler, younger than most, left with a puzzled look and wrote later in his journal, "They do not preserve the teaching. They behave as if they never lost it." And perhaps that was the point. Stillness, in its truest form, does not proclaim itself. It remains. It waits. It adapts without submission and yields without retreat. It flows around obstacles without abandoning direction. Like wind, like water, like the breath between words that give speech its shape. There are no monuments to stillness, no temples carved into cliffs, no bells that chime only when the world forgets to move. And yet, if one listens closely, it is possible to trace its path, not in stone or ink but in the spaces where things were never rushed. Years became decades. The village grew, but only slightly. New homes were built with familiar hands, using methods passed down without ceremony. There were no festivals to honor Laozi, no incense lit in his name. Instead, his presence lived in small habits. A door left open to let the breeze pass through, water carried in clay jars that were never filled to the brim, stories paused in the middle so silence could do its part. The stream had shifted once more. It now ran in a tighter arc around the willow grove, forming a shallow pool where children gathered tadpoles. The stone where Laozi once sat had worn smoother with time. Moss clung to its base. A small sapling had taken root nearby, its leaves trembling whenever the wind passed. Stillness had become generational. The villagers no longer asked, "Who was Laozi?" Instead, they might wonder aloud, "Do the stones remember how to balance?" Or, "Did the wind carry that answer away before it was finished?" These were not questions expecting answers. They were reflections, echoes of a philosophy that never needed defense. In cities far away, Laozi had become a figure of debate. Some called him a myth, constructed to unify early Taoist schools. Others insisted he had authored the Tao Te Ching as a reaction to social decay, a counterweight to Confucian rigidity. His words had been translated into dozens of languages, quoted by emperors and hermits alike. Academics dissected his meaning, pulling apart each line like unraveling thread from a robe. But in the village there was no such unraveling. The fabric remained intact, not because it had been preserved, but because it had never been questioned. A weaver once explained it simply: "The thread does not speak. The pattern tells the story." In this way, stillness passed not as dogma, but as orientation. It shaped how one stirred soup, how one greeted wind, how one stood beside grief without trying to change it. It taught waiting without longing and moving without urgency. It taught how to become porous to time. There came a season when travelers stopped arriving. The roads had changed, or perhaps the world had grown noisier. The village was no longer spoken of in scrolls or whispered between monks. It became anonymous once more, a speck on no map, a bend in the land remembered only by birds and winds. But stillness remained. Not frozen, alive. One morning, an elder with hair like willow bark walked to the river's edge. She had seen many winters, and though her body moved with caution, her gaze held the weight of roots. She sat on the stone, now half covered in moss, and placed her hand into the water. The stream as always accepted. Across the water, a group of children were arranging leaves into patterns along the shore. Their voices rose and fell like bird song, soft, occasional, never too loud. The elder watched them with quiet fondness. One child approached and offered her a stone, flat, warm from the sun. She accepted it without words and placed it beside her on the stone. They both watched it for a moment, not because it held meaning but because it didn't have to. The wind picked up gently. It moved through the branches of the willow. It danced across the water, disturbing no fish. It curled around the two figures on the stone, neither of whom flinched. The elder closed her eyes. The child remained still. Elsewhere, in distant provinces, an archivist attempted to reconstruct the lost original copy of the Tao Te Ching. He gathered fragments, compared ink patterns, debated phrasing. He argued over whether a certain passage should read "return to root" or "retreat into silence." The debate stirred interest, then fatigue. Eventually, new philosophies emerged and the cycle of forgetting began again. But in the valley, no one worried about original texts. Stillness, once learned, does not vanish. It lingers in hands and gestures, in pauses between words, in the space between dusk and lamp lighting. There were no more names for Laozi in the village. He had become unnameable. Not out of reverence, but because no name could encompass the absence he taught people to feel comfortable in. He had become like the wind, not possessed, not tamed, not predictable, only witnessed. And so the story ended not with a legacy but with a continuity. An old stone beside a moving stream. A leaf falling without rush. A child who no longer asks where the wind is going.